Malaysia, 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 Malaysia.
Good evening, everybody. Hello and welcome. It's part 2 of our regular Q&A due to the fact that there was So much going on in part one. We took quite a long time and ended up almost covering barely about 4 questions. So the aim will be to get through considerably more this evening. So, hello to those who have popped into the discussion group so far. So we've got hello out there over on the other side of the water to Kai. Hello to Peter. Hello to Red Star Betty. I hope you enjoyed the Malagasy communist tunes there. And as always, they are available on the Get Chan site on YouTube. And this is of course, the latest in the musical journey that I'm going on and taking you all with me around the musical expressions of the socialist period in many of the African nations, because there were far more African nations that went through a socialist period than we are given to believe. I mean, I had no idea until recently that Benin had a socialist period, and I was vaguely aware of the Madagascan socialist period that ran all the way up to 93. And of course, I knew a little bit about Angola and Namibia and Mozambique, but there's a whole lot more in terms of African socialism to explore, and the music's pretty damn good as well. So I'll be exploring more of that in the future. Hello to Movie Maker Joe. Hello to Roddy. Hello to Zuleika. Movie Maker Joe says, I'm informed by email. How did that database track control system of fascist corporate dictatorship spring up? And why are they emailing me? All right, you got an email about the live stream? Wow. I guess applying for monetization seems to be going well. Maybe the algorithm hasn't quite analyzed where we are yet, or what we're doing. So we will be wading into several things tonight, and I'm going to start with a question from Hugh Markwick that came in on Patreon and reads as follows. Are AI and automation overhyped? Will they lead to massive layoffs? If so, does that undercut the argument that all value is created by labour? Do they weaken working class bargaining power? So, the technological innovation at every stage under capitalism has the potential to weaken working class bargaining power, especially if the working class is already in a weakened situation. Now, there's some instances where, and Marx chronicles this in Wages, Price and Profit and some other works, where the technological innovation concerned happens to come along at a time when it is either spurred on by working class militancy or is a direct response to it. And what that means is that when you got a lot of working class militancy in the middle of the 19th century in Britain, it actually spurred the capitalists to innovate more automated systems in the mills, actually, move away from labour intensive practices. And so you saw wages go up, but then the capitalists innovate to find ways to make up the difference, so to speak. And that happens sometimes. So you can see innovation occur at the same time as a general rise in wages. And what happens, generally speaking, in each wave of technological innovation is that the capitalists will use it in certain ways. They will use it first and foremost to try and rid themselves of workers, but they will also use it to pressurize the position of the remaining workers in an industry to say, well, if you're not going to play ball with us, if you're going to insist on higher wages or better working conditions, then we've got a machine here that can replace you and do it all for us. So make your choice. Accept the crap wages and ever diminishing terms and conditions, or we replace you with a robot. Now, there's an interesting anecdote on this that I came across recently regarding the fact that McDonald's, I believe, had the capacity to fully automate or almost fully automate their customer service functions, their front of house functions, as early as like the middle 1950s. You could order via an intercom, and then the chefs at the back would just shove it onto a conveyor belt, and it would come round, and you could pick it up out of a plastic case. They had to get rid of that because it was probably a bit too early for it. The technology was still in its rudimentary stage, and profits were so high they didn't really need to go down that road. But it does reveal to us another interesting thing. It's one of the reasons why technology is often held back, or that it is the case that the capitalists will choose to center their production in areas of the world with actually lower levels of tech than are possibly available. So, for instance, a famous example of sportswear and other ultra cheap clothing manufacturers staying in factories in Sri Lanka or sometimes Vietnam or Indonesia or Cambodia, which are still running on technology from 30, 40, 50 years ago and employ a hell of a lot of labor, because it's actually more profitable to produce in those conditions than it is to have a fully automated factory in the West, or indeed in China now. And the China example brings up another interesting aspect of this question, which is that where you've got fully automated factories, or nearly fully automated factories, you've got certain aspects of the production line. In some of the Huawei factories, there was an example recently I posted on the Telegram group of a Huawei factory in China that is producing, I believe it's like a washing machine every 15 seconds or something. Well, long aspects of the production line are almost fully automated. And of course, that brings up the question that Hugh's asking there, which is the question of like, well, what does that do with the workforce? Does it lead to massive layoffs? And again, to return to what happens under capitalism, generally speaking, what capitalism does is it lays off a series of workers that are most directly affected by the technological changes. But mostly what they're interested in is running down the wage level and the terms and conditions to the point where it's profitable to employ human labor again, which is the other part of Hugh's question about the source of all labor, or source of all profit being human labor. You see, of course, you can have a fully automated production line. There are many examples in the world now where that does exist, but then that raises two rather obvious questions. The first one is, well, who made the machines, and where did the raw materials from the machines come from? Where does the energy come from that powers the machines? Who built the power plants that process the energy? Who put the power lines up to bring the energy to the factory? Who built the computers that program the machines, and who programs the computers? So again, like on that basic level, you can't get the capitalists can't get away from the need for human labor. And also, it's still the case that they need people to be working to have adequate money to actually buy the consumables that come off that production line. And the fact that, as Marx outlines, each wave of innovation is followed by a round of layoffs, but then when they use the technological innovation and other pressures as well to force down wages, they then say, well, they then want to employ labor again because they've now made it so that the conditions of labor have gone down, so now they can employ people either in a different area in the same area of in the same field of production, or somewhere else where a new element of economic activity has been generated. And this has been the case ever since capitalism first came around. Every technological innovation is part of the shake-up of the system that the capitalists engage in every so often, every few years. And so what you end up with is an area of work either disappearing or being fundamentally changed to take human labor not out of it completely, but to reconfigure it so the labor's in a different aspect of the process, or opening up another field of the economy as a result of the technological change that then people are employed in, often for the lowest possible wage. And that's the same process we've gone through in so many things. People were saying, oh, we'll be getting rid of human beings like 30, 40 years ago, when the first programmable robots came into the car industry, for instance. They were saying, well, there'll be no need for humans at all. And in certain areas of in China, I think in South Korea as well, they have done away with human labor in certain aspects of production. But even in China, in the advanced plants that are building cars now, they're actually employing more people than you would anticipate. And still in areas which are heavily automated, they're still employing an awful lot of people in the production and distribution of cars. So again, it doesn't necessarily lead to the disappearance of human beings and the proving wrong of not just Marx but Adam Smith that human labor is the source of all profit. What it does show is that the capitalists use part of the capitalist strategy with technology is to, of course, try and force down wages. But you find that at the end of the technological process, so the introduction of new technology into the systems of production, the working class is reconfigured, and you come out with the other end of it with a working class which is employed in different industries, or maybe in the same industry but in a different field. But the human labor element is still very much there. And of course, as I said, then you've got the question of, well, how many different people are involved in this production process? And you go and read Adam Smith again from 1776, and he actually spells it out incredibly well regarding the global division of labor. Back then, stating about where the wool comes from, how the wool is sheared off the sheep, how it's taken to one mill to be rendered down and turned into something that's usable in terms of fabric, how it's taken to another mill to be made into the coat, how then a cart driver drives it to market, and how it's then sold. And all of this is part of the realization of profit on the commodity ultimately. So the same still applies now. The AI and automation doesn't get rid of human labor. Some of the wilder capitalists think that it will and hope that it will, but that just goes to show how much these people, or how little these people, don't actually understand the system they're involved in. And that's why an awful lot of them are, a lot of these guys who are loudmouths, like the techno-utopians, people like Musk and others, they're actually just brand managers fundamentally, and part of their brand is sort of techno-dystopianism, which is why they talk up sort of transhumanism, merging humans with AI and cyber to create cybernetic beings and stuff like that. All like crazy shit that they get involved with, which finds a ready audience amongst like these extremely online doomer markets, but it doesn't really take away the fundamental nature of capitalism and why it uses technology and how it uses it. It uses it to reconfigure the workforce, including trying to put downward pressure on wages. I'll end with an example that I was discussing earlier with some party comrades. The question now of using AI, it's not true AI, pattern recognition software in things like the legal profession. That's an interesting change, because as one comrade pointed out in the discussion we had earlier, the things like the legal profession in Britain, and I think this is true, it's true of all the advanced capitalist nations, the legal profession in Britain expanded massively, as did academia and other professions that are at the very highest end of the working class, sort of proper labour aristocracy stuff. Due to the way in which the British government has chosen to use pattern recognition software, they're now able to use it to try and essentially automate as much of the legal process as possible, meaning that the more prestigious position that lawyers used to have is now under threat. Because what they're starting to do is they're trying to like run criminal cases via pattern recognition software. So like the court case is uploaded onto a system, and the role of the judge can get replaced in minor cases with pattern recognition software. And this has sort of called into question like the already pressurized position of lawyers who are under threat from this. And the interesting thing that this takes us towards is, of course, that the areas of the more privileged end of the labour aristocracy are now under threat from machines and from computer technology in a way that they would never have anticipated. Because this is a mad idea that the Tories have had, that Labour's going to progress with anyway. The idea that that they can replace court officials and law enforcement functions with computer technology. Now, of course, being the British government, it'll be poorly funded, it'll be poorly run, it'll be like the worst example of like pattern recognition software going, and the whole thing will be a completely expensive disaster. But they are going to try and use it to pressurize the position of even the relatively privileged layers now, which fits into the wider pattern of proletarianization of even the very upper end of the working class. So, President Jesus comes in and says, I have heard some anarcho-primitivists suggest automation and robotics makes organization and unionization irrelevant. Just drop out and join a commune. Well, they're wrong, and they'll be proven wrong when this whole AI revolution goes through and we find ourselves at the other end with just as many workers, but probably more poorly paid and even worse position with regard to your terms and conditions at work, because that's how it's actually going to be used. The anarcho-primitivists were saying the same thing 50 years ago. If you go back then and look at like the thing, all their stuff regarding like the communication revolution post World War II, they were all saying the same thing. We better drop out. It's all over. The capitalists have won. This is just how these people roll. Some people just like to be doomers 24/7. Hello to CJ out there in Richmond, Virginia. Ben, hello to you, comrade, says the discussion regarding organic versus variable capital and why capital is prone to utilizing lower productivity processes is why capitalists are so afraid of the DPRK. Certainly one of the reasons. The DPRK is pressing ahead with a lot of interesting innovation, it seems, with regard to like high-tech production, because it is a planned economy that is able to actually redeploy workers and use high technology systems to do what the earliest communists were looking at, and what people like Engels and August Bebel wrote about in the 19th century, which is freeing up the working class to spend 3 hours working in the morning, and then 2 or 3 hours in the afternoon playing your part in actually running the country, then doing cultural things in the evening, or whatever combination of the above. DPRK is, because it has a fully planned economy, is pushing ahead with that in very interesting ways. It's one of the reasons why there's just no news coming from the DPRK then other than propaganda. It's like even from China, you'll get some distorted news or other. DPRK is just only propaganda. It's only scare stories. It's like there's things going on there that the capitalists will never want you to find out about. It's what makes it a society so worthy of our interest. Well, yes, they do want their system to live forever, but I very much think it will not. Burke Fay says, fully automated luxury communism now, says Aaron Bastani. Well, the thing is, Bastani is basically a social democrat. He's not a communist by any stretch of the imagination. I don't think he would even claim to be these days. And his book was ludicrous. And the way in which, because it basically the biggest thing that one of the biggest things that's the problem with that book is that essentially it was assuming that like the model of like late stage consumerism we've got now is something which is desirable to replicate. One of the problems I think the Chinese are going to have is that they did for quite a long time think that they were going to work towards replicating a Western consumerist society. And it's one of the things that the Khrushchevite revisionists was so taken with as well. So the issue, of course, being not just one of like pointless innovation and waste, though that is very important in terms of the waste which consumerist society in the West engages in, the waste of resources, the waste of labor, the wasted technologies, but also like the kind of, well, values you grow in your society when you are based around consumerism. And that's the thing that Bastani takes for granted, I think. He doesn't look to communism. He doesn't understand that communism, because it is a whole new mode of production, means a whole new generation of values to go along with it. Societal values are generated along with that mode of production, along with that new mode of government as well, a dictatorship of the proletariat, the rule of the working class. That means a different generation of a new and different set of values that come about over time as the working class grows into its role as the new ruling class, it doesn't mean the values of late 20th, early 21st century capitalist consumerism just get transplanted into a system that you call communism and say, oh, it's fully automated now, everyone can just consume all day. And I find his book ludicrous, to be blunt. I may even do a review of it at some stage. Right. Lavitt says, there isn't the same amount of automation in the criminal court for lawyers in the US, but I can see the threat for public-facing jobs. Not so much the highest-paid lawyers for corporations, though. No, the ultra-high-paid lawyers will remain ultra-high-paid lawyers. What will get absolutely fucked by this is all the services that the working class use. So any legal service that the working class gets to use through the very limited legal aid process in Britain. I don't know if you have the same thing in the United States. I think you have public defenders over there. But any justice process that you need to access as a member of the working class or even the middle class now will probably be like heavily automated or computerized, and the number of people employed within it will be reduced down to zero, or they'll be reduced to just people operating a phone helpline for people who can't use the system. And that'll be like what happens to a lot of jobs in the legal profession. That's the aim. It's de-skilling en masse, basically, is what they're aiming for with the legal profession. Red Star Betty says, you know DPRK has advanced in something for its people because the BBC runs an atrocity, starvation, propaganda story to distract from it. Yeah, the fact that there's no discussion of anything with regard to the DPRK that even remotely approaches the truth should tell you all you need to know. So, hello to Ash in Melbourne. We're going to come up to your question now, which is de-industrialization inevitable under socialism? And you asked this in the Telegram group, and there was posted a couple of articles about it as well. In short, the answer is no. The articles which talk about deindustrialization in the Soviet Union are interesting, but when they regard it as something which was inevitable, that is the wrong interpretation. There was a degree of deindustrialization in certain areas of the Soviet Union that took hold after the coming to power of Khrushchev, but it came about as the result of a reverse in the political struggle, a defeat for the revolutionary proletarian elements in the political struggle inside the USSR. And that comes about because of a triumph of a certain form of revisionism. And it's the same revisionism that had always been there and that Stalin and the other revolutionary leaders were very well aware of, as was Mao in the People's Republic of China. And that is the Bukharinist strand. The Bukharinist strand of thought. Nikolai Bukharin started off as an ultra-left, and the Bolsheviks ended up as an ultra right-wing opportunist. And he vehemently argued against mass industrialization. He argued against collectivization of the land. He argued against the 5-year plans. He worked round the clock to undermine and stop this process and was eventually undeservedly executed. And the Bukharinist argument was that the focus for industrialization should only be on light industry and consumer goods, and there should be no nationalization and collectivization of the land, and that the development of the economy should be focused on the needs of the population in inverted commas, and there should be the ability for kulaks and individual capitalists to get rich. And this is the way in which Bukharin argued against mass industrialization, and thankfully was defeated by the majority in the party on that. And of course, you saw the tremendous benefits of mass industrialization in the victory over fascism and the rebuilding process after World War II. But his arguments didn't go away, because his arguments were rooted in a certain set of ideas that kept popping up and always pop up within the opportunist wing of communist parties. And they came back in a slightly different form with the Khrushchev era, particularly after 1956, when Khrushchev starts listening to the likes of Kosygin And Kosygин's plans were all about, first of all, not prioritizing the investment in the means of production and heavy industry to try and outperform consistently they were starting to outperform the US in heavy industry and in things like steel production by the middle 50s. And Khrushchev derails all that by diverting resources into light industry. And by the way, it totally failed. Growth rates slowly went down and down and down over the next 20 years until eventually they start pancaked under Gorbachev. Now, there's many reasons for that, which we won't get into, but it was the result of the triumph of revisionism in a slightly truncated form because Khrushchev was still constrained a little bit. But their priority was diverted into light industry, production of consumer goods, and the creation of a consumerist economy to mirror what was going on in the US and Western Europe. And that was, again, like the same trend that Bukharin had represented, Khrushchev represented, Kosygin represented, and ultimately Gorbachev represented. It was this opportunism that led the Soviet Union away from the development of means of production. And so there's an argument that some make, which I think has some validity to it, which is also that the discovery and the development of the vast oil fields and gas fields in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and other places in Central Asia and in Russia itself, given when it happened and what happened when they developed it, actually made this process of opportunism worse. Because what it did was it bred like a whole phalanx of managers and officials in concern with the oil industry, whose job it was to go out and sell Soviet oil and gas to countries in Western Europe, and whose salaries became increasingly obscene and whose bonuses became increasingly obscene based on them selling more and more of this stuff. And it's in this layer that more and more opportunism grows. And so when you saw Russia and of course the independent states in the 90s reduced to just being, literally, to use John McCain's term yet again, a gas station run by a dictator, and the dictator was Yeltsin. All of that comes from the period in the 60s and 70s when they were organizing for the exploration of new oil fields, the exportation of gas. These opportunists and these utterly corrupt officials thought that they could make a ton of money for themselves and this growing bourgeois trend within the party and the state if they dropped all the socialism and just became a gas station for Europe, particularly Europe. And so when you get to the collapse and then the post-communist period, where does all of that mania for selling gas and oil to Europe come from? And why is it that Putin and the other leaders are so resistant to realizing that Europe has no independent existence outside of US imperialism's embrace? It's because it all comes from there. It all comes from that period where they developed the oil and gas trade to Europe. And it came because it added to the coffers of the state in a time of high opportunism and degeneration of the Soviet party. It added to the growing bourgeois trend, which ultimately exploded under Gorbachev and destroyed the whole system. So to go back to Ash's question, no, it's not inevitable. There is a struggle to be waged, though, as Mao makes clear in his text on the correct handling of contradictions among the people, and as Lenin always made clear, the opportunist trend is always there, and opportunist pro-capitalist ideas come back into socialist states, but it can be defeated. I mean, the DPRK shows you can defeat it. China for a long time shows that you could defeat it. Particularly the opportunist trend, which is anti-industry, anti-heavy industry, anti the production of the means of production. Because what does that mean? What does the focus on heavy industry mean? And why was Stalin so focused on building up the greater and greater means of production? It's portrayed by bourgeois literature as just a crazy obsession of Stalin's. But if you read his final work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, you can see what his interest is there, which is that the Soviet Union has to continue to build up means of production in order to fully develop the country, because they've made all these great strides in these areas of science and technology, but the country is still underdeveloped in many various different ways, and you can't just flip it over, nor should you desire to like a consumer-based economy, which is what Khrushchev did opportunistically later on. You have to continue to develop, because what you're doing is you're developing the industrial base. You're also drawing more and more layers into the proletariat as a result, and you're strengthening the proletariat along with it. And you flip away from that and focus on what you ended up doing in the Soviet Union, what the Khrushchevites ended up doing, was that they ended up just focusing on the heavy industry they already had. They used like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, places like that, Azerbaijan, as extraction sites, and kept the industry, not exclusively, but largely in Western Russia and, of course, Ukraine, which is why Ukraine's industrial base was so built up. What Stalin wanted to prioritize was developing all of these areas of the Soviet Union, all of these, all the Central Asian states, and all the way out to the east, to a similar level. And so the culture of the proletariat would all come up to a similar level, so that the proletariat could be all taking its place as the ruling class of the Soviet Union at an equal pace all the way across it. They were not anywhere near completing that process yet, but they were on the road to that in the Stalin period. Khrushchev derails it all and unbalances the entire economy and pursues all these different crazy lines under Kosygin and then under Brezhnev, and then you add the opportunism, which is literally fueled by the oil and gas industry and everything else that comes on top of that. And that's why you end up with heavy industry stagnating in the later period of the Soviet Union. It's because of a political struggle that unfortunately the revisionists were able to win. So it's not inevitable. And again, DPRK shows it's not inevitable. You could argue that Laos, even Vietnam to a degree, shows it's not inevitable. And China, whatever criticisms that we have, and we certainly do have them, they're focusing on greater and greater industrialization. Even Russia now, under the Putinist regime, shall we say, the Bonapartist regime, is reindustrializing Moscow. One of the articles that Ash sent me was about the deindustrialization of Moscow. Now they've opened up some economic zones in there. Again, they've had to do it in typical capitalist way, which is bribing capital to invest and also coercing it as well a little bit. And you see now reindustrialization of Moscow again. So again, this process, there's nothing inevitable about it. It's certainly not under socialism, certainly not under a planned economy. Okay, Ash responds. Great analysis. It seems bourgeois economists think deindustrialization, which inevitably happens under capitalism, will happen under socialism without understanding that production is based on need. Well, yes. I mean, the other article that you posted, Ash, was from World Bank, I think, from the 90s, and it's great. It's a great read because it's it's like a pound to the glories of the deindustrialized economy that even the Biden administration is now saying wasn't a good idea, because they've realized that they've essentially mortgaged themselves to countries which they now regard as rivals. And the American imperialists are now frantically trying to reverse the deindustrialization process. But the Biden administration is not managing it. They will have to take on aspects of like a bourgeois version of a planned economy in order to actually reindustrialize even the sections of industry that are just dedicated to the war process. They'll have to either chuck a gigantic bribe at capital to do it, or they'll have to basically take on greater and greater state direction of the economy in order to reindustrialize the United States, because capital's just not going to do it on its own. We should hope that capital remains uncooperative with the US imperialist strategists who do want to reindustrialize. Ben argues exponential growth comes from the base, from heavy industry, not light industry. It is the heart. And that is exactly the correct point. When the Soviet Union was focusing on literally the production of means of production, the growth rates were exponentially higher, and then they start to taper off and then fall apart. The more the Khrushchevites tried to focus on light industry and consumerism, the more things fell apart. And you combine that with them trying to push the working class out of the way and just have things administered bureaucratically and destroying the role of the party, or trying to, and you get a unique combination of circumstances where the working class becomes more and more demoralized, more and more social problems arise, and that all stems from them switching away from heavy industry, them trying to privatize elements of the system, them trying to ape the capitalist systems of the US and Western Europe. And it was a complete disaster. It destroyed socialism in the USSR, which was probably the aim of many of them all the way along. Okay. USSR economic policies, asks Roddy. The book that I'd recommend is the book by Thomas Kenny and Roger Kieran called Socialism Betrayed. You can find that for download anywhere, basically. It's one of the best introductory books about it. You can also find it in Harpal Brah's book, Perestroika, The Complete Collapse of Revisionism. And yeah, those are the two books to get started with regard to the economic policy. The Brah book goes into Gorbachev era economic policy and where it came from in quite some detail. So that's definitely worth reading. Peter asked, do you think it's possible to create a kind of political immunity to the scourges of cynical opportunities in forthcoming socialist societies? Well, yes, I think you have to study the examples of how Lenin struggled against opportunism, how Mao and the Chinese did. Really go into depth about the reality of the great proletarian cultural revolution, its successes and its failures and its drawbacks, and also see what happened and how opportunism triumphed in the USSR. If I get into that, we'll be here all night, but it's definitely possible. I mean, also then study how has the DPRK avoided it. Now, Mao outlines in, again, the text I will be covering at some point soon this week on the correct handling of contradictions among the people, how the struggle for the correct line and the struggle for unity but not unprincipled unity is to be carried out. So this is possible to do. The key thing is in the strength of the. This is the other thing. The Soviet Party lost connection, not entirely, but lost connection with the masses in the way that I think the Chinese Party, even with all the pro-capitalist deviations, did retain it, and certainly the DPRK retained it in People's Korea. So yeah, it's very much possible to get around that. We've just got to learn from the history and adapt it to our current conditions. Possibly worth a whole show on that question alone there, Peter. Right, so moving on. So where are we now? Right, many Black Panthers argued that under certain settler colonial conditions, a lumpen play or can play a more solidly revolutionary role than lumpen elsewhere in the imperial core nations. That's from Daniel from Maryland, and that was in the chat the other night. This is an interesting question. With regard to the classes in colonized societies, are they significantly different to the classes in imperialism? Well, the role they play and the power they have and how these classes interact with each other, yeah, that's going to be conditioned by the colonized status of a nation. I would say, though, that the same broad stroke rules do apply here, which is that the lumpen in any society, whether it's imperialist or colonized, can cause a lot of chaos for the capitalist state by rioting, by staging urban uprisings, and that can be an impetus for some kind of revolutionary move from the proletariat, perhaps. But still, I would say that the most important role in colonized societies is through the proletariat and the peasantry. The most important role in leading the revolution. Certainly, if you look at like China when it was subject to imperialist domination, if you look at Vietnam, if you look at Korea, even though these were peasant-dominated societies, it was the small proletariat and the peasantry working together to lead the revolutionary process who were playing the most important role there. And it was also true in places like South Africa, which was very much dominated by imperialism. It was the black South African proletariat that was in the lead of the struggle against the apartheid regime. And again, like it was in Angola and Namibia and Mozambique in the long guerrilla struggles against the South African domination in Namibia and against Portuguese colonialism. It was the peasantry, the very, very small proletariat, and the petty bourgeois radical intellectuals who were working in concert together in the struggle against Portuguese colonialism in Mozambique and Angola. So I would say that the crucial roles are still held in these countries, but they are still held by the peasantry and proletariat. And even when the peasantry is the dominant force numbers wise, the proletariat has an absolutely crucial role to play in terms of being the lead element in the revolution, and of course being the source of proletarian ideology. The Black Panther approach, when it came to analysing all of the lumpen, I think was deeply flawed. Now, that's not to take away from any of the very interesting things and heroic things that the Black Panthers struggle leaves us in terms of things to learn from, but their approach to the lumpen question inside the United States itself, I believe, was flawed, and it reflected a misinterpretation of the work of Mao, and it also reflected the weaknesses of a left that went far beyond the Black Panthers, which was including the New Left and the student radicals, which the Black Panthers were caught up within, even though they were separate from it, who also viewed the working class in the imperialist nations as hopelessly bought off and immune to class pressures, and therefore that we had to focus on the lumpen, we had to focus on the racial minorities or sexual minorities, all of which was a completely incorrect assumption. And I think that the Black Panthers line on class issues became more and more confused as time went on. And of course, you had a ton of provocateurs thrown into the Panthers by the FBI and other intelligence agencies trying to muddy the waters. But I think that if you look at like the political line that the Panthers took, I mean, people like Fred Hampton were a little bit different. They were looking to actually build a militant black revolutionary organization, but one which was going to be playing a leading role in leading a class struggle. Others were more separatist, others were like obsessed with the idea of a lumpen revolution. It became a very confused organization, and that of course helped the FBI and the American deep state to destroy it more efficiently. And so that would be my answer to that point. Right. Question from Ben, who's with us tonight. How to handle anti-immigrant sentiment exploding in Ireland? Ruling class inflamed it by giving scarce housing to single male Ukrainian immigrants, while Irish families in desperate housing crisis. Well, there's a number of issues to stick together on this one, and I think that in the Irish case, and in our case in Britain too, I'm not sure how this would apply in the United States. Maybe an American comrade can comment on how many Ukrainians have ended up over there. I don't think it's going to be as many as over here. But the housing crisis in Ireland is a very real one. Maybe we've got somebody, I don't know if we've got anybody from Ireland in the chat tonight. Maybe we have. I was last there in the south, in the Free State, so to speak, 13 years ago, and it was just after the crash, and so the housing crisis was getting pretty bad then. It seems to have got worse. Certainly housing in a lot of places in Ireland is incredibly expensive, just as it is in Britain, and the Irish ruling class essentially mortgaged the whole country and bet on the never-ending property boom, and didn't that work out well? American says more Ukrainian women, please. Well, certainly some parts of America do. If you see that the Zelensky is now leading the world in porn production, This goes to show what happens to all these places that get colonized by the United States. But there's several different elements to the question of the Ukrainian migrants and like how to approach this question. The first thing to say, and the first thing which a unified campaign should do, in my view, is look at the question of housing from a class basis. So when you're looking to produce literature, look at why is it that the working class is so short of why is it that the working class is finding it so expensive to live? Why is it that housing is in such short supply? Why is it you go bankrupt trying to rent anywhere or trying to buy anywhere? Why is it that this is happening? So the actual culprits need to be identified, which is of course the Irish ruling class and the way that they've structured the economy to just become purely parasitic. And why is housing a commodity? And the core reasons behind that. When it comes to the Ukraine thing, I think then it has to be approached in several ways. For a start, then you can join up the issues and start talking about, well, why are there so many Ukrainians here? What role is our government playing in making sure they come over here, and why have they been brought over here? So then we have to definitively expose why it is that Ukraine is in the state that it is in, and that means you have to then link it to the war and why it has been produced, why the actual aggression against Ukraine has been waged by the imperialists, and that's why it has been reduced to the state that it has. And the whole issue needs to be exposed before the eyes of the working class. And the way to do that is, of course, then expose the ridiculous profiteering on housing that the Irish ruling class is engaged in. Expose the fact that the entire economy is rigged and is like a complete Ponzi scheme, and of course what has happened to Ukraine and why. Why is it that the Irish ruling class wants to bring in Ukrainians in such large numbers? The answer, of course, is the exact same reason that the German ruling class wanted to bring Syrians in large numbers. When the economy dives again, they're going to need a large reserve army of labour. Ireland's lost a lot of people due to emigration over the last decade or so. So you need to bring in people to replace them in the labour force. And ideally, these people should be cheap and should be easy to intimidate as well. It's always the case that the ruling class plays a double game with the migrant populations. They need them for the purposes of hyper-exploitation and, of course, to add to the reserve army of labour. And the other side of it is that they also recognise that they can play a good role for them, or the hysteria that gets whipped up and the grievances that come about through their presence can be used by the ruling class to whip up division within the working class, which is why, again, this is the bourgeois get people coming and going. On the one hand, they bring people in to work cheaply, and if they're refugees, they come in under specific conditions, they can be easily intimidated. They can be used to add to the reserve army of labour, and you get the left running around screaming immigrants welcome here, and then you get the bourgeois right wingers going around saying kick them all out, and nobody analysing the class aspect of this at all. So you end up with the working class being pushed towards the reactionaries. Of course, the reactionaries in Ireland or in Britain have absolutely no solution, because a lot of them are unwilling to confront the imperialist wars that led so many Ukrainians to be there in the first place. So I think you've got to take this like full spectrum approach, so to speak. You have to inform people, educate the working class as to why this has happened, and then you have to come up with a list of demands based on producing housing as a human need and not a resource, or not a commodity to be sold. And you need to be absolutely clear with people that the Irish capitalist class, unless they've got a gun to their heads, aren't going to solve this. They have no interest in solving it. The only interest they have is in keeping the property bubble reinflated. And again, this is a difficult thing to approach, and it's not going to be easy. It's not easy in Britain either, to overcoming the game that the ruling class has played for so many years of bringing in more migrant labour and then whipping up hatred against it at the same time, then bringing in another wave and whipping up hatred against that. This is the cynical game that imperialism plays, and we have to be ready to formulate demands that can be addressed and demanded about and delivered to various different political representatives. But we need to also be absolutely clear that the chances of getting those approved via the bourgeois process are very, very low. So you need to be then looking at waging a militant struggle for housing rights. Because what the ruling class wants, of course, is the working class to be fighting over crumbs with the newest wave of refugees or newest wave of migrant labourers. That's what the ruling class in Ireland wants. And if the ruling class in Ireland can get more and more people leaving and get more and more displaced people coming in, who, again, easier to manipulate, they're perfectly happy with that. The ruling class ultimately are perfectly happy if the entire nation sinks beneath the waves, as long as it profits up to the last minute. That's the thing. Okay, Ben comes back with, I have a huge extended family in Ireland, hardcore working class, generally anti-racist, sceptical of ruling class narratives, but they're all pissed about immigration, housing issue, narrative working. Well, yeah, because as I said, that's because there's no force. The left in Ireland is a disgrace, largely. If anybody wants to argue otherwise, feel free to do so. But all they've done over this is scream immigrants welcome here, and they haven't addressed any of the issues that are actually affecting Irish workers. So, and again, like this comes back on the question of the war in Ukraine. Again, like the role of the Irish government needs to be exploded and explored. The myths of Irish neutrality, the fact that all of the Irish political parties, including Sinn Féin, are pushing closer and closer to NATO, and the fact that NATO made this war happen for the reasons we've gone into many times. So like that needs to be exposed as well. Again, like a militant struggle against the entire system is the only way that this is going to be solved. Like the Social Democrats who will tell you that, oh, well, if we can just get restrictions on immigration passed, then somehow this will be solved. No, that's not going to change the parasitic and useless nature of Irish capitalism, which can only offer an ever diminishing standard of life for the Irish working class. And it's not going to change the fact that the Irish ruling class are continuing to bury themselves up the arse of the US imperialists and get themselves involved directly in more and more imperialist wars. And they're directly involved in training Ukrainian forces to be thrown into battle now. So again, like this is an issue which should link everything together with regard to the role of the Irish ruling class, why they're completely subservient to US imperialism, why their economy is basically based on property speculation and being a tax haven, and what that means in terms of ever escalating costs of living for the working class, and the cynical way that immigration is used to bring in a new reserve army of labour. All of these things need to be linked together and comprehensively explained in a political campaigning and educational process. Again, this isn't easy. We're starting with very, very few forces here, but that's the only way to proceed. The way of the left, which is scream at the working class and call them racist, isn't a way forward. The way of the racists on the right who tell people that, well, if we just kick these people out, that somehow we'll have it made again, or that this is part of some great rebirth of social democratic Britain or Ireland by kicking out various different waves of immigrants, well, that's a lie as well. All of these narratives need to be completely deconstructed and destroyed via a program of action and mobilization of the class. And that's the only way we've got to go forward. There's no easy way around it. But then again, I don't suppose any of you came on this stream for easy answers. If you want that, go and read Aaron Bastani's latest book. I'm sure he's got an interview with Paul Mason in there that will tell you that voting for Keir Starmer will sort all this out. Or voting for, I don't know, whichever clown leads the Irish Labour Party at the moment will sort all this out. Though, I think 10 years ago, Mason did make an appearance at a Sinn Féin event. So maybe he's diversifying. Okay. Ash says, maybe this can be addressed in another Q&A, but it would be great to hear more about China's housing situation and the role of asset management companies. You are correct, and that will form part of a discussion of the Chinese system at another point in the future. There appears to be a discussion of America's tragic addiction to Slavic women. I will ignore that and move on. Do you think Ukraine war will expand to the West and become a world war? No, not. I think if you could argue that we're in a third world war already. I mean, I posted on the Telegram group the other day that I come to agree with the Chinese historians who locate the beginning of World War II in 1931 with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. So we could, in 10 years' time, see the war in Ukraine as the beginning of World War III. That could be the case. But in terms of what going to happen with this war, it'll eventually find an end, but it won't be the end to the hostilities because, of course, imperialism's crisis necessitates its perpetual aggression. And that's why Ukraine is going to be completely sacrificed. And it's why that they will end up making the Ukrainian state completely disappear. Because as long as the Ukrainian state can be propped up and men can be sent with guns in their hands to die horrifically on Russian bayonets, so to speak, they'll continue to do so because they need this war to carry on. And this, again, is the horrific rationality of the choices of US imperialism. A system in decay, a system that is rotten, but a system which can only be revived by collapsing its closest rivals, the Chinese and the Russians. And so the way in which this has been structured, the way it will continue, is that the Ukraine war will come to a close on the terms dictated by the Russians. They'll probably have to destroy the Ukrainian state and take over most, if not all, of Ukraine. Because again, like the Americans don't want a direct war right now because they can't possibly produce enough material to get involved in it and stand a chance of winning. They can potentially send the Poles in, but again, like that would necessitate the Poles being propped up in a way that I don't think the Americans can. The likelihood is this comes to a conclusion, and then by the time we get to 2025, we'll be looking. The imperialists will be looking doing something with regard to China, probably over Taiwan, as that's the most vulnerable area, and that will be their move. So World War III, if it becomes a thing, if it becomes a reality, is more likely to start in the East. This is a precursor to it. I'd say this is the equivalent of the Manchurian situation of 1931, but obviously in different times. So I'll move to another question. Where are we now? Yeah, right. So Peter asks, could Africa exemplify a wave of revolutionary resolve that could fatally weaken the Western imperial dictatorship? Well, if what happens in Niger and if what happens in other like Burkina Faso, Guinea, Mali spreads further and the Nigerians prevail in their struggle against the imperial puppets in ECOWAS, then that's going to get picked up elsewhere. You can see the imperial system start to wobble in Africa. So what does that mean? Well, that's going to mean that more and more nations are going to want to take a pop at this, and maybe that'll come in the form of more military coups, more kind of free officers movements, shall we say, and that will be the first step. And the more that happens, the more likely it is that one of the imperialist countries, one in this imperialist bloc, will take a punt at some kind of military intervention. And I would bet that if they try and deploy ground forces, it'll be a military intervention that they will lose, particularly if we follow what's going on in Niger and that the masses get mobilized behind this free officers movement, unifying with the army and mobilizing to defend the nation. The imperialists can't win interventions like that. They can only win against like corrupt regimes that are distant from the masses, that can't mobilize them, that basically make every decision wrong that you possibly could. The way Saddam Hussein made every single decision that he had to make wrong when it came to relations with the imperialists, the way that Slobodan Milosevic got everything wrong when it came to taking on the imperialists, the way that Gaddafi tragically got so much wrong when trying to make a deal with the imperialists and not more being inspired by what the DPRK was doing. In the end, the biggest defense of the DPRK, though it's weaponry and what it has achieved in terms of its nuclear program is incredibly impressive. That is all built on the solid base of the relationship with the masses and the perpetual role the masses play in the running of the state and the party, and their role as the rulers of the country. And the more the masses mobilize, as I've said before, in an organized way, be it in Nicaragua, be it in Venezuela, Cuba, DPRK, the less likelihood is of the imperialists being able to actually successfully intervene. They knocked down Yugoslavia and Libya and Iraq because of the weaknesses and the alienation from the masses that all of these governments had, and the failure to mobilize the masses in a sustained way. And had Yugoslavia had leaders capable of mobilizing the masses in its defense, it might still be here, maybe in a truncated form, but it could have perhaps survived. But that would have taken a whole new kind of different leadership than was available with the sort of fading Titoite cadre they had available to them in the 80s and 90s. But moving on, yes. So to address Peter's question, yeah, this could represent a new wave of the African Revolution, and it will have a tremendously damaging impact on the imperialist countries. It could even be the impetus which leads to the breakup of the EU, because if the EU can't exploit or hyper-exploit the African resources and labour, then the EU's got a big problem. We're talking about immigration in the last question. If these countries where these waves of largely working class men are coming out of to try and seek work in Europe become countries which are actually going forward, and there is a positive political movement there that is rebuilding these nations, less and less people are going to want to come across the sea to risk their lives on a raft to get to Europe to work for low wages, when they could play a part in the revolutionary process in their country. And that's going to completely fuck the ruling class of Europe as well, because without that wave after wave of cheap labour coming in, the reserve army of labour isn't getting topped up, and they end up with more and more problems. So this, whatever way you look at it, these are positive things going on in the African nations right now, and we should hope that they succeed and that this spreads. The more this spreads, the more chance there is of weakening the control of imperialism over the African nations. The weaker imperialism gets at home, the more chance we have of taking it down here. So let's continue to watch the situation in Niger and other places and hope that this continues. So where are we now? Okay, another question from Peter. Do you think that covert evils, operations of Washington intelligence agencies, breeds endemic paranoia in them? They trust no one, even one another, and spy on one another, everyone including each other. Well, you've got in the United States right now, and I think this is particularly true of the Trump issue, a series of intelligence agencies which are essentially running almost out of control, and they have become what they used to say, and they still do say, the old KGB was. They or the old Stasi was. They always misrepresent what those organizations, particularly the Stasi, were. But they always say of the Stasi, oh, it was terrible. They spied on everybody. They encouraged sons to turn against fathers, etc. Well, all of that, of course, was being done in the defense of a proletarian state, which, even with its flaws, the working class was still, to a large extent, the ruling class in the GDR. In the bourgeois dictatorship of the United States, what you have is exactly what they said the Stasi used to do, which is like sons turning fathers in, who attended like a MAGA protest or something, and then bragging about it on social media. And you've got all these different levels of police agencies competing against each other for budgets and resources, trying to bring like extravagant anti-terrorist cases against like some Trump supporter who tweeted "fuck Joe Biden" 12 times and like throwing him in prison. There was that case. There's a guy in Florida who I think was like thrown in prison for like an anti-Obama tweet or something a few years ago. Like, you've got this militarization of the police forces in the United States, which is all to do with the degeneration and decay of capitalism inside the US itself. And the only response the ruling class having to the degeneration and decay is to militarize the state forces further, is to step up domestic surveillance, is to beef up the so-called anti-terror laws so that they can throw anybody in prison for the slightest infraction. The British ruling class has done the same. But in America, you've got like a state bureaucracy which is running absolutely wild right now and is becoming more and more irrational. Now, you might say there's a degree of rationality operating there and that they seek to impose terror. But the thing is, they're beginning to look ridiculous. I think what you'll find is that eventually, in this process of degeneration, somebody is going to come along who fancies himself an American Bonaparte and is going to try and arrest the decline of American imperialism by imposing a more directly Bonapartist form of control. And that will be somebody who, from the bourgeois perspective, will need to get a hold of this out of control agencies that are running wild at the moment. And whether anybody can succeed in that process is interesting, but certainly it would seem that the American deep state remains as ruthless and brutal as ever, but appears to be going senile along with its president. At the moment, the Democrats and the Republicans are trying to use the different aspects of the state against each other. Now, it used to be that there was sort of gentleman's agreement between them. They wouldn't do this too often, and certainly not on the national level. Now they're doing it out in the open. Now you got Democrats warning, like Chuck Schumer 7 years ago, going on TV and saying you shouldn't mess with the intelligence agencies because they'll fuck you. And then exactly that happening to Trump. And then if whoever wins the Republican nomination, if they win the presidency, is going to be under extreme pressure to then deliver the Biden family's head on a pike. So this all destabilizes further the bourgeois system. In a time of crisis, you would want to present a unified bourgeois system that could rally the population for war. Now, they might be succeeding in fostering negative opinions about China, but they're not unifying the population. I mean, that's one of the reasons why you're not going to see a direct conflict between the Russians and the Americans in Ukraine. The American military is just not ready. The American nation is just not ready for that. They give it a few years of concerted propaganda and trying to unify the population around a hysterical anti-Chinese narrative, and maybe you'll get that. But at the moment, they're not in a position to do it, I don't think. If I'm wrong, American comrades, please say why I am. Okay. Other question from Hugh Markwick. Why did the USA go into Afghanistan? Well, there's never any just one reason for anything. The main reason was that they weren't ready to go into Iraq straight away. But the bigger, more strategic reason was that they had an idea that Afghanistan was going to work very well as a springboard, partly to Iran, and also as a means of projecting power into the Central Asian region more, which is one of the areas they had in mind that they were going to dominate, which is why the Russian military objected so strongly to Putin collaborating with them, as Putin was still in the phase of trying to buy himself favors with the US, and ultimately that didn't work for him. Was that the Russian military apparently understood what the US was going to try and do, which was they were going to try and establish themselves to be in a position to dominate Central Asia. Of course, it all goes wrong, and ultimately they fail. But I think that's the bigger strategic picture as to why they went there and why they stayed so long. I know there's the Assange explanation that they were laundering money through it or that they were running a drug ring out of it. Both of those things are true, but that's not the reason they stayed there. The reason they stayed there was that they didn't want to lose a potential position for being able to project power into Central Asia. Ultimately, they failed and looked very weak in the process in doing so. But that's the reason why they went in. It was the beginning of an attempt to, again, bigger strategic picture, which is to surround Russia as much as possible and China, because being present in Afghanistan enables you to project power over to the east into China and up north into Central Asia and into lower Russia as well. again, like drawing on what they did or they tried to do through Afghanistan into the Soviet Union in the 80s. So this is all the bigger question, the bigger issue that is at play in Afghanistan in the early 2000s. Not very much talked about. I think Pepe Escobar has written about it quite a bit. It's one of the things that he's correct about, which is that the American play in Afghanistan was about Central Asia and was about dominating that, and of course about threatening Iran. So I mean those things have to be taken into consideration there. So where are we now? Okay, I think we've actually covered all of the questions that came in. So after an hour or so, Zuleika asks, any thoughts on the Guatemalan election results? I know that the centre leftist won, but I don't know enough about him to comment as yet. So I will pick that up on, let me have a think. I'll pick that up probably Wednesday on the live stream I've got planned then, Zuleika, if that's okay with you, because I don't want to give you a half-baked answer. I mean, the only thing I'll say is if he's anything like Gabriel Boric, the Americans have nothing to worry about. But then again, somebody who's actually a sincere Central or South American social democrat is totally unacceptable to the US imperialists. They would rather see literally the devil himself in charge, and indeed they have, I believe, tried to hire him before. So yeah, I'll come back to the question when I've read more about who this guy is and what his platform is. Then I'll be able to address it with some knowledge. The other thing I want to address in a future episode, probably on Wednesday, is the question of the Ecuadorian election. There's been some interesting revelations coming out about that. So maybe we do a bit of a South America focused thing on Wednesday. And also there's the question of the Argentine economy, which remains completely in hock to the IMF. I want to address that as well, because that's a serious problem in South America, and it's a country that's being completely drained, vampire-like, of blood by the imperialists and their financial institutions. So more to come on that. Okay, so I will leave it there for now. My thanks to everybody who tuned in tonight. So Kai, Peter, Red Star Betty, Movie Maker Joe, Roddy, Zuleika, Lord Charfield, Dingo Ate Me Baby, Burke, Ash, Lavitz, Ben Kavanagh. I think, Yuan asks, did you read Paul Cockshott's Towards a New Socialism? I haven't read it yet. When I have, I will report on it. VV says, greetings from California. Down with NATO and down with the corrupt stooge Nicole Pashinyan. Well, yes, he appears to be somebody who is very much straight out of the Color Revolution playbook, in that he's basically seeming to be like an Armenian Zelensky, willing to completely destroy his own nation for a pat on the head from Emmanuel Macron. I can't think of anything more sad and desperate than that. I hope that the Armenians can get rid of him, but they seem to be in a very dangerous situation at the moment. I will at some point I have tried to get guests on from Armenia before, but I've never managed to succeed in doing so. Perhaps that's something for me to return to. Okay. Right, so got some questions there for a future Q&A, and got a load of other stuff to address in the future. Okay, thank you to everybody for tuning in. I'll be back again tomorrow with the much promised review of Steven Seagal's classic Above the Law. Please join me for that.